The night the blizzard arrived, Nathan Greer sat alone in the best cabin he had ever built. He had constructed it himself 12 years ago from old-growth pine selected by hand from 3 different ridges. The logs were straight and true. The chinking was tight. The chimney drew clean. By any measure a man of his trade could apply, it was a fine piece of work, and he had never once doubted it. But that was before the third night of the storm. He sat close to the stove with his hands on his knees and watched the northeast corner of his own wall. Ice had formed there, not on the outside where ice belonged, where any man expected it in a Montana winter. On the inside, a thin white crust creeping down the inner face of the logs, growing slowly, patiently, the way things grow when they have all the time in the world and you have none. Greer was 50 years old. He had been building in this territory for more than 2 decades. He understood wood the way a doctor understands bone. He knew why this was happening. The logs breathed. They always breathed. They expanded in warmth and contracted in cold. And over years, the gaps that formed between them grew wider than any amount of chinking could permanently seal. Wind found those gaps the way water finds a low point in a field. And when wind-carrying moisture met the cold inner surface of a log wall, it left something behind. He reached for the axe handle leaning against the wall beside him. His hand closed around it. He sat that way for a long time, not moving, staring at the ice. If he broke apart the chair and fed it to the stove, the room would warm. The ice would retreat. He would make it through the night. But Nathan Greer had not been wrong about a building in 25 years. And to burn his own furniture meant admitting, even if only to himself, that he had miscalculated. That something he had dismissed was worth considering. That a widow 3 miles north of him building what he had called a dangerous mistake might have understood something he did not. His hand stayed on the axe handle. He did not swing it. Instead, he set it down quietly against the wall, leaned back in his chair, and for the first time allowed himself to truly think about what Margaret Caldwell had built. Not to argue against it, not to find the flaw, just to think about it honestly, the way a craftsman thinks about another craftsman's work when no one is watching. To understand why he was sitting in the dark with ice on his wall, you have to go back 8 months. Back to a woman with a sled full of river rock and a plan that nobody in Judith Basin believed would survive its first winter. The spring of 1883 came late to Montana Territory the way it always did, not arriving so much as leaking through a slow thaw that left the ground soft and unreliable for weeks before it fully committed. When the snow finally pulled back from the hillside behind Margaret Caldwell's homestead claim, it exposed a long shelf of flat ground at the base of the slope, protected on the north by a rise of earth and scattered sandstone outcroppings. Margaret stood at the edge of her cabin's front step and looked at that hillside for a long time. She was 34 years old. She had dark hair that she wore pulled back with a practical severity that left no part of her appearance open to negotiation. Her hands were the hands of someone who had been working without assistance for 2 years strong, across the palm, scarred at the knuckles, permanently stained at the fingertips, from 100 different tasks that required handling rough materials without gloves, because gloves slowed you down, and she could not afford to be slow. Her husband, Walter, had died in the winter of 1881. His freight wagon had broken through river ice 4 miles east of the homestead. They found the wagon. They did not find him until April. Margaret had been 22 days short of her 33rd birthday. Her son, Owen, was 8 years old. Her daughter, Nora, was 5. Most people in Judith Basin expected her to leave. The homestead claim was too large for one person, the winters too hard, the distance to the settlement too far. Several men had offered to buy her out, not generously, but with the particular patience of people who believe they are doing you a favor. Margaret had listened to each offer politely and declined each one with a brevity that left no room for further discussion. She stayed because leaving meant starting over with nothing in some other place that was not yet hers. She stayed because Walter had spent 3 years improving that claim, and she was not willing to hand it to someone else for what they decided it was worth. She stayed because Owen and Nora had grown up in the sight of those mountains, and she did not think she had the right to take that from them. But she also stayed because the land itself had given her a piece of information delivered across 3 brutal winters that she had not finished understanding yet. The log cabin Walter had built was standard Montana work. Pine logs stacked and chinked, a single stone chimney, a dirt floor covered with rough planks. It was the same cabin that 100 other men had built across the territory, and it worked the way they all worked, adequately in mild cold, barely in serious cold, and not at all during the kind of cold that came when the temperature dropped past 20 below and the wind came down from the mountains without breaking. Margaret had learned the cabin's rhythms the way you learn the habits of an unreliable partner. She knew which wall lost heat fastest. She knew that if she let the fire burn down past a certain point before midnight, the far corner would be too cold by 3 in the morning and she would have to get up. She knew that the gap above the east window grew wider every winter as the logs settled, and that no amount of stuffing rags into it provided more than temporary relief. She knew all of this because the cabin had taught it to her one cold night at a time across 3 winters. In the winter of 1881, the first winter after Walter died, Nora had developed sores on her right hand. Not frostbite exactly, just the slow tissue damage that comes from repeated exposure to cold, that never quite rises to injury, but never quite allows healing either. Margaret had watched those sores through the whole of that spring, checking them each morning, the way you check a wound that you cannot stop reopening. In the winter of 1882, she had found Owen sitting beside the stove at 2 in the morning with a fire-tending stick in his lap and his eyes half closed. He was 8 years old and he had woken himself in the night because he understood, without being told, that the fire could not be allowed to die. He had not called for her. He had not woken Nora. He had just gotten up in the dark and done what needed doing. Margaret had stood in the doorway looking at him for a long moment before she gently took the stick from his hand, added the wood herself, and sent him back to bed. He went without argument. He was 8 years old and he already knew better than to argue about fire in January. In the winter of 1883, she had done the math. Over 180 days of cold weather fighting to keep the temperature inside the cabin at a level that was survivable rather than comfortable. She had burned through more than 200 cut logs. She had spent a significant portion of every day either cutting wood, carrying wood, or watching wood burn, and at the end of it in April, when she surveyed her remaining stack, she understood with perfect clarity that she was engaged in a battle she could not afford to keep fighting on its current terms. She needed a different approach entirely. The night the snow finally left that north-facing hillside, Margaret went to the old travel trunk she kept under the bed and lifted out a leather-wrapped bundle that had come with her from Colorado when she married Walter and moved north. Inside was a small collection of her father's things, a level made from handwork brass, a plumb bob on a length of cord, a folded piece of oilcloth containing a set of layout tools and a notebook. The notebook was not impressive. It was a simple sewn paper journal, the kind sold in general stores, filled with her father's cramped handwriting and ink that had faded to the color of weak tea. Edward Aldous had been a stonemason from Cornwall, England, who had come to America as a young man and spent his working life in southern Colorado, building the things that people in warm places always need, and then discover they need in cold places too. Root cellars, spring houses, storage rooms, the occasional foundation that was meant to last longer than the man who commissioned it. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed with the notebook open in her lap and turned the pages until she found the passage she remembered. She had read it as a girl without understanding it. She read it now as a woman who had spent 3 winters losing a battle, and every word landed differently. Her father had written in the slanted hand of a man who had learned penmanship as a second skill after mastering a first stone does not argue with cold. Stone waits. A thick wall of good stone will take the heat you give it and hold that heat long after the fire is ash. The trick is not to fight the cold from outside. The trick is to fill the wall itself with warmth and let the wall do the work through the night. He had gone on to describe in practical terms what he called thermal mass. The capacity of dense material to absorb heat slowly and release it slowly, like a vessel that fills over hours and empties for hours, unlike air which heats instantly and loses its warmth the moment it finds an opening. He wrote about wall thickness and its relationship to how long heat would persist. He wrote about burying the north side of a structure into a hillside where the ground temperature stayed constant through winter, regardless of what happened above. He wrote about low ceilings because warm air rises, and a low ceiling kept the warmth where the people were, rather than gathering uselessly near the roof. He had been explaining these principles to no one in particular, recording them the way a craftsman records what he knows in case someone someday needs it. Margaret turned the last page and sat with the notebook in her hands thinking. She was not an engineer. She was not an architect. She was a woman who had watched her daughter's hands suffer for 3 winters and her son sit alone in the dark feeding a fire at 2 in the morning, and she was done with it. She began gathering stone in May. The hillside behind the cabin offered sandstone in slabs and chunks weathered but dense, the kind of rock that felt solid when you struck it and rang rather than thudded. From the creek bed a quarter-mile east, she hauled river rock, smooth-surfaced, round-edged stones that had been tumbled by water into shapes that fit together with surprising efficiency. From a low depression that old-timers called a buffalo wallow, she collected chunks of pale limestone that she recognized from her father's descriptions as good material for the areas near the fireplace where other stones were likely to crack under prolonged heat. She built a simple sled from salvaged planks and used the homestead mule to drag loads from the ridge in the creek bed. When the mule was needed for other work, she pulled the sled herself. It was slow. It was heavy. By the end of May, her shoulders had developed a persistent ache that she managed by ignoring it. Owen began following her on the third day, not asking permission, simply appearing 20 feet behind her on the trail with a short board he had nailed into a rough, flat shape, one medium-sized stone sitting in the center of it. Margaret noticed him the first time she looked back. She said nothing. She turned around and kept walking. From that day forward, they worked together every morning without discussing it. By July, she had enough material to begin laying the foundation. She had chosen the flat shelf at the base of the north-facing hillside with deliberate care. The slope would protect the north wall and allow her to bury it into the earth. The flat ground gave her a level base without requiring excavation beyond what she could manage, with a spade and a wheelbarrow. And the aspect of the site meant the small window she planned for the south wall would receive maximum winter sunlight during the hours when the sun was low. She used the layout tools from her father's bundle to establish her corners. She drove stakes, ran cord, checked her diagonals. She mixed mortar from clay and sand in the proportions her father had described, tested it, adjusted the clay, content tested again. She laid the first courses of stone on a morning in mid-July when the air was warm and the clay dried quickly enough to give her an honest read on the work. The walls began to rise. She was 3 courses up on the north wall when Nathan Greer came. He came in the afternoon riding alone, and he stopped his horse well back from the work site the way a man stops when he wants to observe without committing to engagement. He sat for a while looking at the low stone courses rising from the flat ground at the mortar joints at the hillside Margaret had chosen as her north wall's backing. Then he dismounted and walked closer. Margaret was mixing a fresh batch of mortar. She heard him approach and did not stop what she was doing. Greer was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of physical presence that came from decades of work rather than size alone. He wore his authority the way he wore his tools, as a natural part of himself, not as something he needed to demonstrate. He had built more structures in Judith Basin than any other man. He had opinions about building that were well-founded, and he knew it, and this combination of genuine expertise and settled confidence had over the years hardened into something that was not quite arrogance, but lived in the same neighborhood. He looked at the stone courses. He looked at the site. He said, not unkindly, but without hesitation, "Stone is cold in winter." Everybody knows that. Margaret kept working. "Stone is cold when it is empty," she said. "Stone that has had time to warm holds heat differently than wood. Have you ever put your hand on the wall of your root cellar in the middle of winter?" Greer had. He did not answer directly. "It is warmer than the air outside," Margaret said, "because the earth around it keeps a steady temperature, and the stone has absorbed it. I am building the same principle into a room with a fire in it. The stone will take the heat, and it will give it back slowly all night after the fire has burned low." Greer was quiet for a moment. Then he said what he had actually come to say. "I have built cabins for most of the families in this basin. If you sit in that stone house and come through the winter on less wood than a timber cabin uses, people will ask me why they paid for my work. Margaret stopped mixing and looked at him directly. You build houses to sell. I am building a house to live in. We are not competing for the same thing. There was a silence between them that carried more weight than the words on either side of it. Greer said, I am telling you this as someone who knows construction. Stone breathes differently than wood. Moisture will collect. Mold will follow. You will be back in a timber cabin by spring. Margaret said, I will keep that in mind. Greer mounted his horse and rode back toward the trail. He did not look back. Margaret watched him go. Then she returned to the mortar. She was not angry. She had expected resistance from the moment she decided to build. What she had not expected was the form it took a week later. On a Tuesday morning in early August, she came out to the work site before sunrise, as she always did to begin the day's laying before the heat of the afternoon made the mortar dry too quickly. The north wall was nearly 4 feet high. She had spent the previous afternoon carefully setting and leveling a course of particularly large sandstone slabs that would anchor the section where the wall would eventually meet the buried hillside. 3 of those slabs had been moved, not fallen, moved. They lay at the base of the hill, displaced from their positions in a way that gravity alone could not explain. The ground around the base of the wall showed disturbance, the kind of irregular surface left by boot heels, rather than the sliding marks of rolling stone. Margaret stood in the gray morning light and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Owen came out of the cabin behind her wrapped in a jacket carrying 2 cups of coffee. He stopped when he saw her expression and then looked at the wall and understood. He asked, who did that? Margaret said, it does not matter. Owen said, it does matter. She looked at her son. He was 9 years old and he had his father's way of standing when he disagreed with something. Weight shifted to 1 foot, chin slightly forward, not aggressive but not yielding either. What matters, she said, is that the wall still stands. They moved 3 stones, the rest did not move. I am going to reset those 3 and add something so that they cannot be moved again. She handed him back his coffee and picked up a stone. Owen set his cup on the ground and picked up a stone too. They worked for 2 hours before breakfast. When they were done, Margaret had reset the displaced slabs and wedge-packed earth beneath the base of each one, a modification she had been considering anyway for the lower courses. The wall was better for it. She noted this without satisfaction or irony. It was simply true. That evening, after Nora was asleep, she told Owen what she had decided. If something like this happens again, we say nothing and we fix it. The wall will speak for itself when winter comes. That is the only argument worth making. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I am going to get up early tomorrow too. She looked at him. He said, to be here when you start, in case someone comes before the sun. Margaret thought about refusing. He was 9 years old and she did not want to add another weight to the list of things he already carried. But she looked at his face and understood that this was not something she could refuse without taking something from him that he needed to give. She said 7 o'clock, not before. He was up at 6:30. She pretended not to notice. The summer continued. August brought the kind of heat that Montana produces briefly and intensely, as if making up for the months it cannot manage it, and Margaret worked through it, building the walls higher, checking her plumb bob, adjusting courses, fitting the complicated jigsaw of different stone types into a structure that was not beautiful to look at, but was becoming stone by stone exactly what she had intended. In the second week of August, Leonard Finch came. Finch was 55 years old, a former Union soldier who had come west after the war with the particular purposefulness of men who had seen disorder and decided to spend their remaining years creating the opposite. He was the settlement's designated authority on matters of communal governance, a role that carried no salary and no formal power, but a great deal of practical influence because he was the man people brought disputes to and the man whose signature appeared on the letters that went to the territorial office in Helena. He arrived in the late afternoon carrying a folded piece of paper, which he handed to Margaret, with the manner of a man delivering something he wished he did not have to deliver. The document was written in the formal language that bureaucratic discomfort tends to produce. It expressed concern from unspecified community members regarding the non-standard nature of the construction, being undertaken on the Caldwell homestead claim, and suggested that structures of unusual design might be subject to review regarding their compliance with the standards expected of homestead improvements. Margaret read it twice. She recognized the phrasing. It was not how Finch wrote. He was a plain language man, a quality she had always respected in him. This was someone else's language tidied into official form. She said, "Who wrote this?" Finch did not answer directly. He said, "There are concerns from members of the community." She said, "Whose concerns?" He did not answer that either. She said the Homestead Act does not specify building materials. A person can construct any improvement on their claim as long as they inhabit it and work the land. "You know this. I know you know it." Finch said, "The concern is about safety, about whether the structure will serve as adequate shelter." She looked at him steadily. "If you want to take my claim," she said, "come with a court order. Do not come with concerns." Finch held her gaze for a moment, then looked away. He took the paper back from her hand without pressing the matter further, folded it, and put it in his coat pocket. He said that he hoped she understood he was only conveying what had been brought to him. She said she understood perfectly. He turned his horse back toward the trail, but he did not ride immediately. He sat for a moment facing away from her, looking at the structure rising from the hillside. His posture changed in some ways she could not precisely name. A settling, perhaps? The kind of adjustment a person makes when something they have been holding in tension is quietly released. He had served in the Wilderness Campaign of 1864. He had slept in field fortifications built from whatever material the ground offered, including stone. He knew what stone felt like from the inside of a rough-built structure when the temperature dropped and the wind came in from a direction that had been cutting men down for days. He knew that the cold inside of a stone structure was different from the cold inside a wooden one in ways that were not subtle. He rode away without speaking again. What Margaret did not know and would not know for months was that Finch went home that evening and opened the journal he had kept since the war, the one he wrote in most nights before sleep, and made an entry. The entry was short. It said, "The Caldwell woman is right about the stone, but I could not say that to her today. The pressure from Greer is too consistent and his influence too broad. The question is whether it will matter when winter comes." And then in a second line added below the first, as if it were a thought he tried to resist and could not, "I hope she does not stop building." The walls reached their full height in September. Margaret stood back from the completed structure on a cool morning in the first week of that month and looked at what she had made. It was not impressive by any conventional measure. It was low with a sod-covered roof that barely cleared 7 feet at its interior peak, and the walls had the rough, uneven texture of hand-laid stone built by someone who was not a trained mason and had not been aiming for elegance. The 2 small windows on the south face were covered with oiled canvas rather than glass, which gave the whole front of the structure a provisionally incomplete look that would not improve until spring. Jacob Hartley rode past that afternoon on his way to the northern range and stopped his horse. He looked at the building for a while. He said it looked like a root cellar. Margaret said it was warm. Hartley made a sound that was not quite a laugh and rode on. The remarks at the settlement store were consistent and creative. "Stone gets cold. She will be back in a timber cabin by spring." Nathan Greer, who had moved from direct confrontation to the more durable tactic of allowing other people's doubts to do his arguing for him, was heard to say that he had warned her about moisture and he expected to be proven right before February. Margaret heard these things through the inevitable channels by which information travels in small communities, and she did not respond to any of them. She had no interest in arguing about what the building would do before winter had demonstrated it. Words were not evidence. She had said what she had to say. The stone would say the rest. On the first night she slept inside the finished structure, she lit a small fire in the new stone fireplace and let it burn for several hours, feeding it steadily as the stone of the firebox and surrounding walls absorbed the heat. She put Owen and Nora to bed in the low loft space above the main room, where the warmth accumulated naturally beneath the sod roof. Nora, who had not yet been told in specific terms why they had moved from the log cabin, pulled her blanket up and said with the matter-of-fact certainty of a 6-year-old that it was warm. Then she closed her eyes and went to sleep. Margaret banked the fire at 10 o'clock and sat for a while in the darkened room. The flame was down to coals and then to ash, and the room continued to hold its temperature. Not dramatically, not with the aggressive heat of a fire at full output, just steadily, patiently, the way a hand held against a sun-warmed stone in the evening still finds warmth there long after the sun is gone. She sat in that warmth and thought about her father's hands, which had been like her own, strong across the palm, scarred from stonework, stained in ways that never fully washed out. She thought about the notebook and the faded ink and the sentence that had found her at exactly the right time. Stone does not argue with cold. Stone waits. She thought about 3 winters of care taking a fire that would not stay lit. She thought about Nora's hands and Owen in the dark at 2 in the morning. She sat for a long time alone in the quiet warmth of the building she had made, and she did not get up to check the fire. There was no fire to check. For the first time in 3 years, she did not need to. Outside, the October wind was beginning to find its voice in the gaps between the hills. The nights were getting longer. The temperature was dropping by a few degrees each week. November was coming, and with it the kind of cold that separated what worked from what merely seemed to work. Margaret Caldwell blew out the lamp and went to sleep. 3 miles to the south, in the finest cabin in Judith Basin, Nathan Greer sat at his table and looked at his drawings of what a good timber structure should look like, and he was sure of every line. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours. That is not a figure of speech. On the morning of November 18th, the thermometer outside the Judith Basin settlement store read 22 degrees above zero, which was cold but manageable, the ordinary cold of a Montana November that men had learned to work in. By mid-afternoon, the sky had changed color in the particular way that old-timers recognized, and newcomers had to learn through experience, a flat yellow-gray that sat too low and too still, pressing down on the ridgelines like a lid being fitted over a pot. By evening, the wind had arrived from the northwest, not gusting, but sustained, the kind of wind that does not announce itself and does not stop. By midnight, the thermometer read 19 below. By the second morning, it would read lower still. But that comes later. What matters first is the week before the storm and a conversation that took place at the settlement store that most people did not think was important at the time. Frederick Pritchard had arrived in Judith Basin 2 years earlier from Missouri, where he had taught school for a decade before deciding that the frontier offered something that a classroom could not. He was 45 years old, lean and deliberate in his movements, the kind of man who asked questions before forming opinions, and was consequently regarded with mild suspicion by people who preferred to operate in the opposite order. He subscribed to 3 scientific journals that arrived by post from St. Louis, usually 6 weeks late and sometimes damaged by weather, and he read them with the focused attention of someone who understood that information was a resource as real as timber or water. In late October, he had ridden out to Margaret's homestead with a thermometer and a blank notebook, not to make a point, but to gather data. He spent a morning in the stone house, taking readings at regular intervals, measuring the interior temperature against the outside air, noting the time since the last fire had been lit. He worked quietly and methodically, and Margaret let him work without interruption, which was, in his experience, the most respectful thing anyone had ever done for his process. When he was finished, he sat at her table and looked at his numbers. The fire had been out for 14 hours. The outside temperature was 28 degrees. The interior of the stone house, in its warmest corner near the old fireplace wall, read 61 degrees. In its coldest corner, the northeast, it read 54. He said, "This is not luck." Margaret was at the stove making coffee. She said no. He said, "The stone is still releasing heat from yesterday's fire." 14 hours later. She said, "My father called it memory. The stone remembers the warmth you gave it and gives it back slowly." That was how he explained it to a child. The actual principle is in his notebook if you want the technical version. Pritchard did want the technical version, and Margaret gave him the notebook, and he spent an hour reading it at her table while she worked outside. When he left, he thanked her in the careful way of a man who understands he has been given something of value. The following week at the settlement store, he made the mistake of sharing what he had found with a group of men that happened to include Nathan Greer. He was not trying to provoke a confrontation. He was simply describing his observations the way he always described things, with numbers and a timeline and no editorializing. He said that he had measured the interior of the Caldwell stone house at 14 hours after the last fire and found temperatures between 54 and 61 degrees, and that the numbers did not support the prediction that the building would fail. Greer was leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee, and he listened to this with the patience of a man who has already decided what he thinks and is waiting for an opportunity to say it. When Pritchard finished, Greer said, "You measured in the morning after a fire burned all evening. Of course the walls were still warm. That does not prove anything about a real winter night." Pritchard looked at him. He said, "The fire went out at 6 in the evening. I took the reading at 8 the following morning. That is 14 hours, Mr. Greer, with no fire, at 28 degrees outside." Greer said, "One measurement on one morning is not a winter." Pritchard said, "You are correct. It is not. But it is data, and data is more reliable than opinion. And the opinion you have been sharing with this community for 4 months is that the building will fail. I am telling you that the numbers I collected do not support that prediction." The store was quiet in the way that small spaces become quiet when the people inside them recognize that something real is being said. Greer put down his coffee cup. He said, and his voice had shifted into a register that the men in that room had heard before, the register he used when he was not arguing, but declaring, "I have been building in this territory for 25 years. I know what works and what does not work. That woman is going to have a very cold and very difficult winter, and when she does, I expect I will not hear any apologies from the people who encouraged her." He left without waiting for a response. The men in the store stood in the particular silence of people who have just watched someone say something they cannot take back. Pritchard wrote one more figure in his notebook, closed it, and said nothing further. What no one in that store knew was that Greer, riding home that afternoon, had pulled his horse to a stop on the high ground east of town and sat for several minutes looking north toward the dark outline of the hillside where Margaret's stone house sat low and heavy against the slope. He had done the arithmetic in his head, the same arithmetic he always did when evaluating a structure: the relationship between wall thickness and thermal retention, the significance of the buried north wall, the logic of the low ceiling and the heavy sod roof. He had been doing this arithmetic privately and without admitting it for weeks. The numbers kept coming out in her favor. He rode home and did not tell anyone what he had calculated. The blizzard announced itself on the evening of November 17th with a stillness that was more alarming than wind. Animals felt it first. Hartley's cattle moved to the south end of their pasture without being driven. The homestead dog refused to go outside after dark. Margaret, who had spent enough winters in Montana to read the sky the way her father had taught her to read stone, looked at the sunset and went to bed early, after making sure the wood supply under the lean-to was fully covered and the stone house door was seated properly in its frame. She did not feel fear. She felt readiness, which is a different thing, the specific calm of a person who has made their preparations and understands that what comes next is not within their control and therefore not worth spending energy on. By morning, the storm was real. It came in from the northwest with the kind of authority that makes human construction feel like opinion rather than fact. The wind was not gusting. It was a single sustained force, massive and indifferent, driving snow horizontally across the basin in sheets that reduced visibility to the length of an outstretched arm within 30 minutes of full daylight. The temperature at dawn was 7 below zero. By mid-morning, it had dropped to 14 below and was still falling. Inside the stone house, Margaret added 2 logs to the fire. At first light, banked them carefully so they would burn long and slow rather than hot and fast, and then made breakfast. Owen ate at the table. Nora ate standing up, as she always did when she was excited about something which Owen found annoying, and Margaret found privately endearing. The wind outside was a presence rather than a sound, a deep, sustained pressure against the walls that you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. Nora asked if she could go outside. Margaret said no. Nora asked why. Owen said, without looking up from his food, "Because it is 40 below and you would freeze in 6 minutes. Nora considered this information and sat down. The stone walls did not vibrate. That was the first thing Margaret noticed, that she had not fully anticipated the stillness of the structure under load. The wind hit the south face and the west face, and the sod roof and the building absorbed the impact the way a cliff face absorbs waves, not by resisting and flexing, but by simply being too dense and too heavy to be affected by anything the storm could do. The oiled canvas over the south windows moved slightly at their edges. Nothing else moved at all. She added 2 more logs at noon. 3 miles south of her, in the settlement proper, Leonard Finch spent the first morning of the blizzard in the settlement store, which had become an informal gathering point for people who lived close enough to reach it on foot. There were 11 people in the building by mid-morning, crowded around the central stove, and more arrived through the day as the temperature in outlying cabins dropped to the point where gathering in a common space made more sense than staying alone. The school teacher, Mrs. Brennan, arrived at noon, having left her small single-room cabin because she could no longer maintain a temperature in it that she felt was safe. She was embarrassed about this and said so, and the man nearest the stove moved aside to make room for her without comment. Finch stood at the front window of the store for a long time, looking north. He could not see Margaret's hillside. He could barely see the far end of the main street. What he could see was the snow moving horizontally past the glass in a way that made the outside world look less like weather and more like a conclusion. He thought about the entry in his journal. He thought about the word yet. He did not say anything to anyone about what he was thinking. By the second day, the storm had not broken. The temperature had continued to drop. It was 22 below zero by mid-morning, and the sustained wind made it feel worse than the number suggested. The wood supply at the settlement store was being rationed by common agreement, a tense and imperfect process that required Finch to exercise a kind of leadership he had not needed before, not the authority of procedure and paperwork, but the harder authority of keeping frightened people from making decisions that would hurt them. Jacob Hartley had ridden to the store on the first morning on a horse that he had to lead the last 100 yards because the animal refused to move forward into the wind. He was burning through his firewood at a rate that surprised him. He had stacked what he calculated was a generous winter supply, and the storm was eating through it with an appetite that his calculations had not accounted for. He stood at the store window beside Finch and said, with the blunt pragmatism of a man who does not waste words on complaints, "I will be out of wood by day 4 if this keeps up." Finch said, "You are not the only one." Hartley said, "What about the woman on the North Hill?" Finch looked at him. Hartley said, "The stone house. I have been thinking about it since yesterday morning." Finch said nothing, but he turned back to the window. 3 miles north, on the morning of the second day, Margaret was doing something that no other person in Judith Basin was doing. She was sleeping, not because she was careless, not because she had underestimated the storm. She was sleeping because the fire she had banked the previous evening had kept the interior temperature stable through the night, and there had been nothing to wake her. Owen had slept in the loft without stirring. Nora had not coughed once. The wind had hammered the walls for 12 consecutive hours, and the walls had not noticed, and Margaret, who had spent 3 years waking at 2 in the morning to feed a fire that was losing its battle with the cold, had simply slept until dawn for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember. She lay still for a moment after waking, listening. Wind. The distant sound of something shifting on the roof, snow settling into a new configuration under its own weight. And beneath all of that silence, the particular silence of a space that is holding its temperature, that is not leaking warmth, that does not need intervention. She got up and added 2 logs to the coals. The fire came back without complaint. It was on the afternoon of the second day that Helen Marsh appeared at the door. Margaret heard the knocking through the wind, which was itself a remarkable thing, because the wind had been loud enough to mask most ordinary sounds for 36 hours. She opened the door and the cold came in with a force that briefly made the interior feel like the outside. And then she saw Helen Marsh standing on the stone step, with her 7-year-old daughter Grace pressed against her side, and she understood immediately what had happened without needing to be told. Helen was 40 years old, a woman of composed and careful presentation under normal circumstances, the kind of person who understood the social architecture of a small community and maintained her position within it with consistent effort. Margaret had known her for 4 years. She had sat across from her at the quilting circle, shared meals at community gatherings, and received from her 8 weeks earlier, in front of 8 other women, the particular condescension of being worried about loudly and publicly. What stood on the stone step now had very little in common with that woman. Helen's face was the color of old ash. Her lips had gone to a purple gray that Margaret recognized as the early presentation of serious cold exposure. The girl against her side was not crying, which was worse than crying would have been, because children who have moved past crying into silence have generally crossed a line that requires immediate attention. Margaret did not speak. She looked at the child for 1 second, then stepped back and opened the door wide. They came inside. Helen stopped 2 steps past the threshold and stood still. The change in temperature was not violent, as it would have been in a cabin with a roaring fire pushed to its limit. It was even, steady. The air in the room was warm, the way a room is warm when it has been warm for a long time. Not warm in the desperate way of a fire burning at maximum effort against a cold it cannot fully defeat. Grace sat down on the floor, not dramatically, not collapsing. She simply sat down the way a child sits when they are finally somewhere that feels safe, and she pressed her back against the wall nearest her and closed her eyes. The wall was warm. Helen felt it too. She put one hand flat against the stone and stood there with her palm pressed to it, and her expression changed in a way that had nothing to do with pride or embarrassment or social standing. It was simpler than any of those things. Margaret put more water on to heat and did not say anything about the quilting circle. They sat together through the afternoon while the storm pressed against the outside of the building and found no way in. Grace ate and warmed and became by degrees a 7-year-old again rather than a hypothermia case. Helen held her tea with both hands and did not speak for a long time, and Margaret did not prompt her. When she finally spoke, she said, "I told people the stone would be cold and damp." Margaret said, "I know." Helen said, "I was wrong." Margaret said, "Yes." There was a long silence. The fire burned at its moderate, unhurried pace. The walls held. Helen said, "Where did you learn this?" Margaret said, "From my father. He built things like this in Colorado when I was a child. He said the knowledge came from builders before him, old builders, the kind whose names nobody remembers. He said somewhere along the way, people on the frontier forgot it, and he was not sure why, but he thought it had something to do with trees being faster than stone, and faster being easier than right." Helen looked around the room, the low ceiling, the thick walls, the small windows, the way the space felt inhabited all the way to its corners, rather than just at the center where the heat source was. She said, "It does not look like a house." Margaret said, "It looks like what it is, a structure built to do one job extremely well." That night, Margaret sat alone after Helen and Grace had fallen asleep, wrapped in blankets in the corner. Owen and Nora were in the loft. The fire had burned down to coals, and the room was holding its warmth the way it always held it, without drama, without the anxious accounting of wood and time that had defined every winter night of the past 3 years. She reached under his bench where she kept the notebook and held it in her lap without opening it. The leather cover was worn smooth at the corners from handling. She thought about her father's hands. She thought about the evening in Colorado when she was perhaps 8 years old, and he had taken her into a root cellar he had just finished building in the middle of summer and pressed her small hand against the interior stone wall and asked her what she felt. She had said cold, and he had said no, not cold, stable. There is a difference. Cold is absence. What you are feeling is presence. The stone has been here long enough to find its temperature and hold it. That is not cold. That is steadiness. She had not understood the distinction at 8. She understood it completely now. She opened the notebook to the last page where her father had left several blank lines at the bottom after his final entry. She found a pencil. She wrote in her own handwriting beneath his, "He was right, November 1883. Then she put the notebook away and sat in the dark, in the warmth, and listened to the storm, doing its worst work against the outside of her walls, and the walls answered it with silence, which was the only answer the storm deserved. The third day was the worst. The temperature reached 40 below zero in the early morning, a figure that the thermometer at the settlement store recorded and that subsequently passed through the community like a piece of information people wish they did not have. At 40 below, exposed skin freezes in under 2 minutes. At 40 below, the moisture in your exhaled breath freezes before it disperses. At 40 below, the question stops being about comfort and becomes about survival. And the two things are separated by a margin that feels uncomfortably small when you are the one doing the accounting. Nathan Greer was alone in his cabin on the third day. He had not gone to the settlement store. He had his own supply of wood and his own stove and his own considerable stubbornness, and he intended to wait out the storm in his own structure, which he had built with his own hands and which he believed was as good as any timber construction in the basin. He had been feeding the stove consistently, not letting it drop, burning more wood per hour than he would have liked, but maintaining a temperature that was livable, if not comfortable. The northeast corner of the wall was worse. The ice that had begun forming there on the first night had grown through the second day, despite the fire, because the fire was heating the air in the room, but the air was escaping through gaps in the wall, and the replacement air coming in was colder than the fire could handle fast enough. The corner was in a kind of permanent deficit, a place where the energy going in never quite caught up with the energy going out. He sat and looked at it on the morning of the third day for a long time. Then he did something that cost him considerably. He took out a blank sheet of paper and a pencil, and he began to draw. Not the cabin as it was, the cabin as it could be if you kept the timber frame as a shell and built a secondary wall inside it from stone filling the gap between with packed earth for insulation, creating within the existing structure something that functioned on the principle Margaret had applied from the beginning. He worked slowly because he was a builder, and he thought in 3 dimensions, and this required translating a new set of principles into the spatial language he actually spoke. He drew the wall section. He drew the corner detail. He drew where the stone mass would sit relative to the fire source to maximize the absorption and distribution of heat. The drawing took him 2 hours. When he was done, he looked at it for a long time without expression. Then he folded it carefully and put it in the chest pocket of his coat close to his chest where it would stay dry. He had not admitted anything to anyone. He had not changed his public position. He was still, as far as Judith Basin was concerned, Nathan Greer, who had warned Margaret Caldwell that her stone house would fail. But the drawing existed, and he knew what the drawing meant. At the settlement store, Leonard Finch was managing a situation that had moved past the boundary of his experience. 23 people were sharing a space built for commerce, sleeping in shifts, burning the store's supply of heating wood at a rate that everyone could see was unsustainable. There was no outright panic because these were people who had chosen to live in a hard place and had collectively developed a tolerance for difficulty. But there was a tight-wound quality to the air inside that space that had nothing to do with the temperature, a social pressure that comes from people who are frightened and tired and do not want to show either. A man named Dawson, who had a homestead 3 miles east, said in the afternoon of the third day that he had heard the widow on the North Hill had built herself some kind of stone bunker and was sitting pretty while the rest of them froze. He said it in the tone of a complaint, as if Margaret's preparedness were a form of inconsideration. Finch, who had been listening without comment to conversations of this type for hours, said quietly, "She built what she built because she understood what was coming. That is not luck, and it is not inconsideration. That is work." The room was quiet after that in a way that was different from its usual quiet. Finch turned back to the window. He was thinking about his journal entry. He was thinking about the word yet and whether the time it had been pointing toward had arrived or whether it was still somewhere ahead of him. The fourth morning came with silence, not the silence of the storm pausing the brief-held breath that experienced people had learned not to trust. True silence. The wind had stopped sometime in the deep hours before dawn, and the absence of it was so complete that it woke Margaret before first light, because she had been listening to the wind for 3 days, and its absence registered as a change in the world. She lay still and listened to nothing. Then she got up and looked out the south window. The sky above the ridge was beginning to lighten. The air was still and crystalline in the way that follows a spent storm, cold, with a clarity that had nothing aggressive in it, just the pure, indifferent clarity of a temperature that simply was what it was. The storm was over. She made a fire for the first time in a full day, not because the building needed it urgently, but because she wanted hot food and coffee, and because Owen and Nora would wake soon, and the morning deserved something that smelled like breakfast rather than emergency. She was drinking her first cup when she heard a different kind of knock at the door, not the panicked hammering of someone in crisis. A single deliberate knock, the knock of a person who was not sure of their welcome, but had decided to come anyway. She opened the door. Raymond Mathers stood on the stone step. He was 60 years old, a trapper who had been working the country north of Judith Basin for more than 2 decades, a man so accustomed to the outdoors in all conditions that the concept of shelter was for him largely theoretical. He was wearing 3 layers of everything, and he had the look of a man who had been moving hard for several hours, which he had sheltered in a rock outcropping 2 days' walk north when the blizzard hit, the way he always sheltered when caught in the open, and he had been making his way south since before dawn. He stopped at the threshold and looked at Margaret. His face was frostburned at the cheekbones, and he needed to eat, but he was standing without difficulty, and his eyes were clear. He said, "I thought I would find you frozen." Margaret stepped back. He came inside. He stood in the center of the room for a moment, feeling the specific quality of the warmth that the stone gave. He had slept in rock formations his entire adult life and understood better than most what stone did and did not do with temperature. But he had never stood inside a human-built room with walls and a ceiling and a fire and felt the deep, settled warmth that came not from the fire itself, but from every surface surrounding it. The distinction was subtle and unmistakable. He looked at the fire, small, easy burning without urgency. He said, "How much wood did you burn?" Margaret went to the lean-to, and he followed her. The wood supply was stacked under the low roof covered with a tarp essentially intact. He stood in and looked at it for a long moment, doing the accounting that any person who heats with wood does automatically what had been there, what was gone, what remained. He said, "That cannot be right." Margaret said, 11 logs. "I burned an extra one because I had guests." Mathers turned and looked at her. He was not a man who showed surprise easily. He showed it now. He reached out and put his hand flat against the exterior stone wall. The north faced the wall buried deepest in the hillside. He left it there for several seconds. The stone was not warm exactly, but it was not cold the way stone was supposed to be cold in a Montana November after 4 days of the worst blizzard in 20 years. It was something between those things, something that did not have a simple name, but was unmistakably evidence. He said, "I am going to tell people what I saw here." Margaret said, "You do not have to." He said, "I know I do not have to." Owen was standing at the door of the lean-to, having come out quietly in the way of a child who has learned to be present without interrupting. He looked at Mathers with the careful assessment of a 9-year-old who has been paying attention to the world for longer than most 9-year-olds are asked to. He said to Mathers, "Did you get cold out there?" Mathers looked at the boy. He said, "Yes." Owen said, "Is it different in here?" Mathers looked around the lean-to at the wood supply at the stone wall at Margaret, standing with her arms crossed, watching the exchange. He said, "Son, it is about as different as 2 things can be." He left within the hour, heading south toward the settlement, moving with the steady, purposeful pace of a man who has somewhere to be and something to say when he gets there. Margaret watched him go from the door of the stone house, and beside her, Owen watched too, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then Owen said, "He is going to tell them about the wood." Margaret said, "Probably." Owen said, "Oh, and they believe him." Margaret looked at the sky, which was brightening now into the hard, clear blue of a post-storm morning, cold and definite, and without apology. She said some of them will need to see it for themselves. And that is all right. Seeing is better than being told. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The wall held." Margaret said, "The wall held." They went inside, and Margaret added a log to the fire, and the stone house, which had been warm for 4 days without drama, continued to be warm. 3 miles south, Nathan Greer stepped out of his cabin into the post-storm morning, reached into his coat pocket, and felt the folded drawing still there against his chest. He had not shown it to anyone. He had not decided yet what to do with it. But he had not thrown it away. Raymond Mathers reached the settlement store before noon. He had been walking for 4 hours through the aftermath of the storm through snow that in places reached his thighs and in other places had been scoured down to bare frozen ground by the wind. And he arrived looking like what he was, a man who had spent the better part of a week outdoors in conditions that had driven everyone else inside. The men at the store saw him come through the door and read his face before he said a word, because Mathers was not a man whose face moved easily, and it was moving now. He stood at the stove and drank a cup of coffee that someone handed him, and then he told them what he had seen. He told it plainly without embellishment, the way he always told things. The wood supply, the 11 logs, the temperature inside the stone house after 4 days of the worst blizzard any of them could name. The wall that was still warm to the touch on the north face. The room was quiet while he talked. When he finished, it stayed quiet for a moment longer. Then someone said 11 logs. Mathers said 11. She burned one extra because she had a guest. Jacob Hartley was in the room. He had been at the store since the second day of the storm, having burned through his personal supply faster than he had planned, and come to the communal space with the particular expression of a man who is making the best of a situation he does not want to explain. He stood against the back wall with his arms crossed and listened to Mathers without moving. When Mathers finished, Hartley looked at the floor. He did not say anything, but the set of his jaw changed the way a man's jaw changes when he has been chewing on something bitter and has finally decided to swallow it. By evening, 6 people had ridden north to see for themselves. Margaret opened the door each time without comment. She let them come in. She let them feel the warmth and look at the walls and check the wood supply themselves. She offered coffee when she had enough to offer it, and when she did not, she offered nothing because she was not performing hospitality. She was simply living in her house and allowing people who were curious to observe that fact. Frederick Pritchard came on the second day after the storm with his notebook and his thermometer. He spent 3 hours taking readings documenting the interior temperatures at each wall, measuring the recovery time after the door had been opened repeatedly to admit visitors. He worked with the focused precision of a man who understands that the most important thing he can do in this moment is create a record that cannot be dismissed. When he was done, he went to Margaret and showed her the numbers. 1 week of interior readings morning and evening. Outside, temperatures ranging from 18 below to 4 above zero as the post-storm cold settled and then slowly, grudgingly began to release. Interior temperatures ranging from 63 to 71 degrees with the variation attributable almost entirely to the frequency of door openings and the duration of each fire rather than any failure of the structure. Margaret looked at the numbers. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "What are you going to do with these?" Pritchard said, "I am going to write them on a piece of paper and put them outside the store where people can read them. No names, no argument, just the numbers." Margaret said, "You do not need to put my name on it." Pritchard said, "I was not going to. The numbers do not need a name. They speak well enough on their own." He rode back to the settlement and did exactly what he had said he would do. He wrote the figures in large, clear script on a shiny sheet of paper and tacked it to the board outside the store door. 2 columns, one for the stone house, one for a timber cabin of comparable size, his own cabin, whose consumption he had been tracking with the same obsessive consistency he applied to everything. The difference was not close. It was not a matter of degree. It was the kind of difference that once seen could not be unseen. People stood in the cold and read it and did not speak immediately because the numbers required a moment of private reckoning before they could be addressed publicly. Leonard Finch read it on the morning of the 3rd day after the storm. He stood in front of the board alone in the early morning before the store opened, with his breath making small clouds in the still, cold air. He had been thinking about his journal entry since before the blizzard ended. He had been thinking about the word yet, and about what it meant to know something was true and choose for reasons of social expediency to stay quiet about it. He had served in the Union Army for 3 years. He had seen men make decisions based on what was politically manageable rather than what was correct, and he had seen what those decisions cost. He had come west partly to escape the kind of institutional cowardice that puts convenience ahead of truth, and he had spent 3 months in Judith Basin being precisely the thing he had come west to leave behind. He looked at the numbers on the board for a long time. Then he went home and got his journal. He arrived at Margaret's door in the late morning with no announcement and no explanation. He knocked once, the way a man knocks when he is not sure of his welcome, but has decided the uncertainty does not excuse him from coming. Margaret opened the door. She looked at him. He was holding the journal against his side with one hand, and she noticed it but said nothing. He said, "May I come in?" She stepped back. He came in without pausing to look around. He set the journal on her table and opened it to the entry from October, the night she had handed him back the document that Greer had drafted in bureaucratic language, and he had delivered without sufficient backbone to refuse. He had something to do, and he intended to do it before his nerve failed him. He said, "Read the last 2 lines." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the journal. She read it. She read it a second time. She said, "You wrote this before the storm." He said, "Yes." She said, "You knew then." He said, "I knew then." She closed the journal and pushed it back toward him across the table without speaking. She went to the stove and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him and kept one for herself and sat down across from him, and he understood that she was not going to make this easy for him, which was, he thought, entirely fair. He said, "I am going to make a formal entry in the settlement record, describing the construction, describing the results of this winter, and stating for the record that the Caldwell Stone House represents a legitimate and proven improvement to homestead standards. I should have done this in August instead of delivering someone else's complaint to your door." Margaret said, "Why did you?" He said, "Because Greer has more influence in this community than I have courage, or I had less courage than I needed." Either way, the result was the same. She looked at him steadily. He did not look away. She said, "I want you to know that there was a night in August after you came here with that document when I sat with my father's notebook and genuinely considered stopping. Not because I thought I was wrong about the stone, because I was tired of being right in a way that no one wanted to hear." Finch said nothing. He absorbed this. She said, "I did not stop, but I want you to understand that your silence had a weight, not just the document, the silence." He said, "I understand." She said, "Good. Then write what you need to write." He took his journal and left. He did not apologize in words because the journal entry was a more honest form of apology than words would have been, and Margaret understood that. She watched him ride away from the window, and then she turned back to the room and the fire and her children. Owen had been sitting in the corner the entire time with a book open on his lap, in the particular stillness of a child who is listening carefully to everything. He waited until Finch was gone, and then he looked at his mother. He said, "Was he sorry?" Margaret said in his way. Owen said, "What does that mean?" She thought about this. She said, "It means that some people do not know how to say the thing directly, so they show you the evidence that they knew they were wrong. It is not as clean as an apology, but it is more honest than most apologies are because it costs more to show evidence than to say words." Owen considered this. He nodded slowly in the way he nodded when he was filing something away rather than simply agreeing. Nathan Greer came on a Monday morning in the first week of December. He came alone as he always did when he came to important places. He rode up to the stone house and dismounted without rushing and tied his horse to the post Margaret had set into the ground near the door, and he stood for a moment looking at the structure from the outside before knocking. He was doing what builders do when they approach another builder's work, reading it on its own terms, assessing it without the distortion of opinion, seeing it as the thing it had actually set out to be. From the outside, it was still not beautiful. It was still low and heavy and settled into the hillside with the unpretentious permanence of something that had not been built to impress anyone. But Greer was no longer seeing it the way he had seen it in July as an affront to his expertise. He was seeing it the way he should have seen it from the beginning, as a solution to a specific problem executed by someone who understood the problem completely and built accordingly. He knocked. Margaret opened the door. They looked at each other for a moment across the threshold. There was a great deal in that moment that did not get said because neither of them was a person who spent words they did not need to spend. He came in without being invited. She stepped aside, which was invitation enough. He walked the room the way he always walked, A room he was assessing, not casually but systematically, touching things, checking his senses against each surface. He put his hand on the west wall near the fireplace. He moved to the east wall, the far wall, the wall that was hardest to keep warm in any structure. He pressed his palm flat against it and held it there. She watched him. She did not speak. He moved to the northeast corner, the corner that corresponded precisely to the corner in his own cabin where the ice had formed on the first night of the blizzard. He put both hands on the stone there, one high and one low, and stood that way for several seconds. The stone was warm, not dramatically, not the warmth of proximity to a fire, the steady, patient warmth of mass that had been doing its job without interruption for weeks. He dropped his hands and reached into his coat and took out the folded drawing and set it on the table. Margaret looked at it without touching it. He said, "I made this on the third day of the storm." She unfolded it. She looked at it for a long time. It was a cross-section drawing of a wall system timber frame on the exterior stone core, inside packed earth between them. The proportions were correct, and the corner detail was thoughtful in a way that showed the builder's instinct operating at a level beyond the immediate problem. He had thought through not just the principle, but the application, not just what would work, but how to make it work within the constraints that most families in the territory actually faced. She said, "This is good work." He said, "It is your principle. I just figured out how to build it with what people here already have." She said, "That is not a small thing. That is the difference between an idea and a tool." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to build one for a family who cannot afford to start from scratch. Use their existing cabin as the shell and build the stone interior into it. See if the numbers come out the way they should." She said, "They will." He said, "I know, but I want to do it. I want to build it with my hands and know it from the inside." There was a pause in which both of them understood what was not being said. He was not apologizing. He had told her in July that he was not a man who apologized easily, and that was still true. What he was doing was more difficult and more specific than an apology. He was asking to be part of something he had spent months opposing, not because he had changed his nature, but because his nature, which was fundamentally the nature of a builder, had finally won the argument with his pride. Margaret said, "The Dawson family east of town. 3 children. Their east wall is the worst in the basin." He said, "I know the cabin." She said, "Start there." He folded the drawing and put it back in his coat. He started toward the door. Then he stopped and turned back and said, "I was wrong. Not about everything. About this." She said, "I know you were." He nodded once. He went out. Owen appeared from behind the curtain that separated the sleeping area from the main room. He had been standing there, and Margaret had known he was standing there, and she had let him stay. He said he did not apologize either. She said no. He said, "But he is going to build it." She said yes. He thought about this for a moment. He said, "Is that better than apologizing?" Margaret looked at the door Greer had just walked through, and then at her son, who was 10 years old and already asking the questions that matter. She said, "For a man like that, it is the only apology there is, and it will last longer than words." The winter of 1883 to 1884 came in time the reference point that Greer had predicted it would be, though not in the way he had intended. It became the winter people pointed to when explaining why the building practices of Judith Basin changed, why the next generation of structures in that part of Montana was different from the generation before, why the word insulation entered the practical vocabulary of homestead construction in a territory that had previously treated warmth as a matter of burning enough fuel rather than building well enough to need less. Jacob Hartley built a stone-cored bunkhouse for his ranch hands in the spring of 1884. He did not explain why he changed his approach. He did not discuss it with Margaret. He hired a man who had worked with Greer on the Dawson job and told him to do it the way Greer had done it. The bunkhouse went up in 6 weeks. That winter, his ranch hands burned half the wood they had burned the year before and slept through the night without tending the fire, which Hartley regarded as an operational improvement and reported to no one as anything else. When people asked Hartley about the change, he said only that he had run an experiment. He never mentioned Margaret Caldwell by name, not to be dismissive of her, but because Jacob Hartley was a man who expressed respect through imitation rather than attribution, and everyone in the basin understood that about him, and Margaret understood it too. She was not looking for a citation. She was looking at a bunkhouse built in stone, and that was enough. Helen Marsh persuaded her husband to rebuild the north wing of their house in stone that same spring. Her husband objected to the expense and the disruption. Helen, who had spent one night pressed against a warm stone wall with her daughter in a widow's house during the worst blizzard in 2 decades, said simply that she had made her decision and intended to proceed with it. And her husband, who was a practical man at heart, looked at her face and understood that this was not a conversation he was going to win. The north wing went up that April. Helen supervised the construction herself, measuring the wall thickness against the specifications she had quietly copied from her memory of Margaret's walls, estimating by eye and touch, rather than number. It was not identical to what Margaret had built, but the principle was the same. In the following winter, the north side of the Marsh house was the warmest room in the building, and Grace, who was 8 years old by then, claimed it as her own. Frederick Pritchard wrote up his findings and sent them to a scientific journal in St. Louis in the form of a careful letter describing the construction methods and the thermal measurements he had recorded. He did not know if it would be published. It was. The letter appeared 18 months later under the heading Practical Notes on Stone Construction in Cold Climates, and was read by people who would never know that the measurements had been taken in a small stone house in Judith Basin, Montana, by a man with a notebook and a thermometer, in the particular stubbornness of someone who believes that numbers are more useful than opinions. Mrs. Brennan, the school teacher, visited the stone house in February on a day when the temperature had dropped to 12 below and stayed there all afternoon. She had been to the building once before briefly in the confusion of the days after the blizzard, but she had not stayed long enough to understand it. This visit was different. She came with a purpose, and she stayed for an hour asking Margaret questions and taking notes in the margins of a lesson book she carried everywhere. Margaret answered every question directly. She showed Mrs. Brennan the mortar joints and explained why the clay and sand ratio mattered. She showed her the buried section of the north wall, the 3 feet of stone that disappeared into the hillside, and explained that this was where the structure connected to the Earth's own stable temperature rather than fighting against the fluctuations of the air. She showed her the low ceiling and the way the heat gathered there rather than escaping through a high roof. Mrs. Brennan took notes on all of it. Then she stood in the center of the room and was quiet for a moment, the way a teacher is quiet when she is converting an experience into something she will be able to explain to others. When she finally spoke, she said, "I have been calling this a fortress since November. I was using the word as a compliment, but I think I was wrong about what the word meant. A fortress is built to keep enemies out. This is built to keep something in. That is a different kind of structure entirely." Margaret said, "That is exactly right." Mrs. Brennan wrote about it in the school paper she produced each month for the settlement families, a single paragraph accurate and unembellished describing what Margaret had built and why it worked. It was the first time Margaret's name appeared in print in connection with the stone house. Margaret read the paragraph twice when she received her copy sitting at the table with her morning coffee. She did not say anything to Owen or Nora about it. She folded the paper and put it in the trunk with her father's notebook. Something quieter and more durable than pride, she thought. That was the only name she had for what she felt. The Dawson job was finished by February. Greer had worked through the coldest weeks of January on it, converting the east and north walls of the Dawson cabin from pure timber to a composite construction timber frame standing stone core built inside it, the gap between filled with packed earth. He worked in conditions he would not normally have attempted because Daniel Dawson had 3 children and an east wall that was losing the battle badly. The work was slower than any job Greer had done in years because stone required a patience that wood did not, a willingness to wait for mortar to cure and for courses to settle before adding the next layer. He found to his own considerable surprise that he did not mind the waiting. He found, in fact, that he preferred it. When the job was done and the Dawson family moved back in, Greer stood in the main room with Daniel Dawson, and they both felt it, the difference in the air, the way the heat distributed itself without urgency to every corner, rather than concentrating itself near the stove and fading as you moved away. Dawson said nothing for a moment. Then he said it felt like a different house. Greer said that was exactly what it was. He rode home that evening and took the folded drawing from his coat pocket, where it had been since the third day of the blizzard. He unfolded it and laid it on his workbench and looked at it for a long time. Then he began copying it cleanly onto fresh paper, adding dimensions, annotating details, turning a private crisis calculation into a document that another builder could actually use. He called it a composite wall specification. Somewhere in the exchange of information that followed as he shared the document with other craftsmen, and other craftsmen modified it and passed it further on, the name that attached itself to the method was not his own. People called it the Caldwell method, and the name stuck with the persistence that practical names have when they are accurate and there is no one with sufficient authority to change them. Greer did not object to this. He had not invented the principle. He had built the tool, and the tool had earned its name from the person who had understood what needed building in the first place. On a morning in late March, when the light was beginning to hold past 4 o'clock, and the south-facing slopes were showing the first tentative brown at their edges, Margaret and Owen were repairing a small section of the exterior east wall where the freeze-thaw cycle of late winter had shifted a stone out of true. It was not serious damage. It was the kind of maintenance that any structure requires after its first hard winter, the settling of materials into their permanent relationship with each other. Owen had become, over the course of the winter, a competent assistant. Not a mason, but a person who understood what level meant and why it mattered, who knew how to mix mortar at the right consistency and how to read a plumb bob, who could set a stone and check it without being told to. He worked beside Margaret with the quiet efficiency of someone who has done a thing enough times to stop thinking about the mechanics and start thinking about the result. He was seating a wedge stone in the lower course when he asked without looking up, who taught grandfather? Margaret was mixing mortar. She said the men who were building in Cornwall before him, generations of them. He said their names were mostly lost. You learn from a man, and then you learn from the work itself, and the names get left behind while the knowledge keeps going. Owen said, so grandfather learned from people whose names nobody knows. And he taught you, and you built this. She said, yes. He fitted the wedge stone, checked it with the plumb bob, tapped it once with the heel of his hand to seat it fully. He looked at it. It was correct. He said, and I will teach someone. It was not a question. It was a statement of intent from a 10-year-old boy who had spent a winter watching his mother be proven right by evidence, and who had drawn from that experience the particular conclusion that only children draw cleanly, that the knowledge a person carries is not theirs alone, that it belongs to whoever needs it next, and that passing it on is not generosity but obligation. Margaret set down the mortar bucket. She looked at her son. She thought about her father's hands on her small hand against the root cellar wall. She thought about the notebook with its faded ink and the 2 lines of handwriting at the bottom, his and hers. She thought about the winter that had just passed and the 3 winters before it, and the decision she had made when the snow left the hillside in April, and she had stood at the edge of her cabin step, looking at the ground that would become something. She said, yes, you will. Owen nodded and picked up the next stone. They worked in silence for another hour, mother and son, on the wall of the house that had answered the blizzard without raising its voice. The morning was cold and clear. The mountains to the north were white against a sky so blue it looked painted. Somewhere to the south, in the basin where the settlement sat, and the people who had doubted and then understood were going about the work of a Montana spring, Nathan Greer was teaching a young carpenter the patience that stone required, and the young man was learning that different was not the same as harder. The stone house stood on the hillside and absorbed the March sun through its south windows, and held the warmth in its walls the way it had held every warmth given to it since the first fire of the previous summer, doing what stone does, what it has always done, what it will continue to do long after the people who understood it are gone. Margaret Caldwell did not build a monument. She did not set out to change her community or prove a principle or win an argument. She set out to keep her children warm through the winter without burning herself down to nothing in the effort. Everything else that followed from that was secondary, a consequence of the specific and unargued truth that the work produced. The building still stands north of what is now Lewistown, Montana. The roof has been replaced twice. The sod is long gone from the top of it. But the walls have not moved because walls built the way those walls were built do not move. They were not built to be impressive. They were built to last, which is a different ambition entirely and a more reliable one. If you go inside on a winter afternoon before anyone has lit a fire, you can still feel it. Not dramatically, not in the way that makes a person gap or look around for an explanation. Just the particular quality of air in a space that has been inhabited and warm for more than a century, that has held heat through more winters than any of the people connected to it lived to count. That was built by a woman who remembered something the frontier had forgotten and who understood that remembering put to work with patience and stone was enough. On the interior frame of the door, carved into the stone, was something narrow and deliberate. There are 4 letters and a number MC and OC in the year 1883. Margaret Caldwell, Owen Caldwell, mother and son who built it together. They did not carve their names to be remembered. They carved them because they had been there and they had done the work, and the work deserved a witness, even if the only witness available was the stone itself. The stone has been a reliable witness. It has not forgotten a thing.